Saturday, February 9th, 2019, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today I'd like to talk about inflation and how words have been corrupted and how inflation is still out there and is one of the reasons why we're seeing the rise of populism and movements like Brexit, movements like the Yellow Vest. So yeah, I want to talk about that today and look at some books that I've read about Tudor England, 16th century England. Really interesting books. Highly recommend them. It's like a series. Before I start though, I'd like to thank all the viewers, all the subscribers for their support of the channel. I really appreciate it. It's been over 3 years now that maneco 64 has been going on. And hopefully it will keep going on, for a lot longer. Yes, thank you for all the donations, all the interaction as well, all the comments, all the suggestions. A lot of times my ideas come from viewers' suggestions, which is really, really great. And I appreciate, nice compliments. I appreciate criticism. Thank you again. Yeah, all the support, all the donations through PayPal, Patreon, and all the support through the purchasing of maneco 64 merchandise. We've got and the Fed mugs and the Fed t-shirts, Billy mugs. Link to the maneco 64 store is in the description of every video if you're interested, of course. So inflation. Before I go on to the book and a little more, the definition, I'd like to talk about my time working in the markets in the city of London. Also, when I started out in Switzerland, I started out in the back office of a small private bank in Geneva. So that was in the late 80s. And then when I came to London, in the early 90s. I remember a lot of times the most important data were out of Germany. At the time we still had the Deutschmark. The Bundesbank is still around, but the ECB has kind of superseded it. And the Bundesbank was known for being a very serious central bank. The Deutschmark was very hard currency. It had appreciated throughout the 50s and 60s versus the dollar, versus the pound. And in spite of that, the German economy kept growing, kept becoming a powerhouse, which it still is, with an appreciating currency. And why was that? Well, I think it was because the Bundesbank, when it was founded, I think it was in 1948 or maybe 1950. I think it was 1950 if I'm not mistaken, but just a few years after the war, Germany had two currency collapses in the first 50 years of the 20th century. Of course, we had the Weimar hyperinflation, the famous Weimar hyperinflation of 1923, when the Reichsmark collapsed. And then after World War II, Germany was in ruins, and their currency collapsed as well. So they had to, under U.S. guidance, U.S. occupation, they actually developed the Bundesbank. And the Bundesbank became very, it epitomized sound money. It was very, very strict, in terms of inflation. It kept a tight rein on money supply. And I remember in the early 90s, Germany didn't have a CPI statistic. It was called the cost of living statistics. Because CPI, and nowadays they call CPI inflation. Back then, everyone had CPI. I guess the UK had RPI, but Germany was cost of living. But I'm not sure when it changed. It was probably when Germany joined the Deutschmark was assimilated into the euro. And now Germany uses the term CPI, and most people nowadays call the CPI. When CPI comes out, people say, "Oh, inflation numbers have come out," even though the cost of living or consumer price index is just a measure of how prices are moving. Inflation itself is purely a monetary phenomenon, and nothing more. Even during the gold rush in California in the mid 1850s, 1849, and the few years after that, they found, of course, a lot of gold in California. It was a territory, I think, at the time they found the gold, and it quickly became a state. But there was prices were high and localized, near the mines. Everything was very expensive because there was a lot of money around. There was a lot of gold. But nationally throughout the US, there was no inflation. So yeah, there can be inflation as well under a system where you use gold and silver, but it's very, very rare. It's only when you find the biggest gold find in history, you have a little bit of inflation in the area for a few years, but that's about it. So as you can see, it's a purely monetary phenomenon. And I like to go to one of a dictionary that was actually my dad's. He gave it to me back in the early 80s, I think. It's a Merriam-Webster dictionary from the 70s. It's still in good condition. I've kind of lost the back cover, but so I've done this before, probably in one of my videos. It was a while ago. So I like to look at the definition of inflation. So this dictionary, this edition was from the 1970s. Doesn't really say exactly what year, but I remember my father buying it in the 70s. So I'll read, and it says, an act of inflating, the state of being inflated, the empty pretentiousness, pomposity, and then the one we're more interested in, an abnormal increase in the volume of money and credit resulting in a substantial and continuing rise in the general price level. So that's very interesting, isn't it? Because nowadays, when we get CPI data, which is the consumer price index, which is a measure of the price level, they call that inflation. While back in the 70s, inflation was the abnormal increase in the volume of money and credit. So what have we had in the last 10 years after the crisis of 08? We've had an abnormal increase in money and credit, and the CPI. How come the CPI hasn't risen more? Well, because if you've looked at shadowstats.com and John Williams, you will see that the way they measure the CPI now is completely different from when this dictionary came out in the 70s. If we measured CPI like they did back in the 70s, it would be more like 8 or 10%, which would, of course, reflect the inflation that we've had. The only place that that the inflation's kind of being reflected upon in the last 10 years has been in paper assets, financial assets, like the stock market, but like the bond market, but not in the CPI, because they've lied about it. And the other thing they've done is that they've kind of corrupted the definition of inflation. If you ask even economists and people working in the city and politicians, when you say, oh, inflation has been abnormally high, in the last 10 years, they'll say, no, it hasn't. CPI has been around 2%. There's no inflation, which is, of course, rubbish. So I wanted to check as well here, economicshelp.org. It says here, inflation is basically a rise in prices. So this economicshelp.org, they've completely corrupted it as well, because we know inflation is the abnormal increase in credit and the money supply, right? So they say inflation is basically a rise in prices. A more exact definition of inflation is a situation of a sustained increase in the general price level in an economy. What situation is that? Well, the situation is because the central banks and government have been conspiring to increase money and credit. And how do they conspire? Well, governments conspire by running endless deficits, like in the United States. And it's even easier for the US because they have the reserve currency. And what does the Federal Reserve do, even though they're supposed to be independent? Well, they manipulate interest rates lower so that the government can keep issuing this abnormal amount of debt. And what does the Fed do? Well, they create the credit to buy this debt, and they pump it into the banking system. It's no wonder that the general public is feeling it. They've been able to do it in Japan for the last 30 years. It's 30 years now, 1989 to 2019, that they've had this financial repression in Japan. But the Japanese society, for some reason, they've kind of taken it. But I'm not sure if we in the West are going to take another 20 years of this, because this is what is happening. I personally don't think so. We're seeing the symptoms of the fact that the cost of living is rising. You just have to look at the protests in France, the Yellow Vests or the Gilets jaunes. They're starting their 13th week of protests today. And I recommend you guys go on to wearechange.org on YouTube, because he's in Paris there today covering it. The mainstream media is completely ignoring it, and I don't think it's over. What about in the UK and other countries like Italy? Populism is rising. We've had Brexit. It's because of that. It's because of inflation. Yeah, they even have to lie about it, the CPI and the RPI, because even though they've changed the definition of inflation, they've corrupted the word, they still can't keep the measures of prices low enough, so they manipulate it. I mean, in the UK, we've got interest rates around 1% to below 1%, but the cost of living is rising, at least 5% a year. And that's why, things are not great. And the same thing in the U.S. I'm sorry to say, President Trump's State of the Union address focused on, the unemployment rate, which doesn't count all the millions and millions of people who've given up looking for a job. He didn't talk about the massive debt that the United States has of 21 trillion. He didn't talk about the 21 trillion dollars that have been missing. He didn't talk about the $1 trillion deficits he's running for this great economy. So it's all a facade. It's a Potemkin village. And like Jim Sinclair said the other day, it's all going to implode one day. And that's why if you do have savings in the bank, you'd be crazy, in my opinion, to leave too much in there. I mean, yesterday I was looking, I saw in the shop, the lottery, they're playing the Euro Millions, it's called, every Friday and Tuesday as well. But yesterday the prize was 120 million pounds. And I was wondering, what if you won 120 million pounds? I'd be worried, because can you imagine all that 120 million pounds in a bank? I would be really concerned. It would be, difficult to protect that, because when you think about it, in the bank, only 85,000 is protected. So I think in the next crisis, the very wealthy who do not protect their assets or their savings, they're going to be in for a hard awakening when everything implodes. You know, for the average person who doesn't have that much wealth, I'm not saying it's going to be great. It's not going to be good, but you have a lot less to lose, of course. But anyway, what about the other book I wanted to talk about? Well, Tombland. This is by XgCTCWb. It's part of the Matthew Shardlake series. This is the last, you know, the latest one. I think is the 7th. And it's about, I'll read here on Wikipedia. So it says here, the Shardlake series is a series of historical mystery novels by XgCTCWb set in the reign of Henry VIII in the 16th century. While this is just a little bit after Henry VIII died, and I've just started reading it. I think my wife had read half of it already, but she's reading something else now. But this is, you know, the series started with Dissolution, Darkfire, Sovereign, Revelation, Heartstone, Lamentation. Yet Tombstone is the 7th. So, and I've just started reading it, and this is like historical fiction, but some of it is true, but they use characters that didn't exist. So I just wanted to read to you, right in the beginning here, Matthew Shardlake. And I'll read a little bit about Shardlake before I go here. It says, the series protagonist is the hunchbacked lawyer, Matthew Shardlake, who is assisted in his adventures by Mark Power and then Jack Barak. Shardlake works on commission initially from Thomas Cromwell in Dissolution and Darkfire, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer in Sovereign and Revelation, and Queen Catherine Parr in Heartstone and Lamentation. In the 7th book, Tombland, he works for Lady Elizabeth, who then becomes Elizabeth I later on. But I found it interesting here on page 14. They've gone to Hatfield Estate, which is where Lady Elizabeth lived. So they had to travel there overnight. When they get there, the innkeeper says, I would be obliged, sir, if Master Parry could pay your guests' charges in gold coin. The silver coinage is so debased. He shook his head. And then Fowbray, who's part of the Elizabeth I, well, Lady Elizabeth's household, says, and Fowbray was he was the guide for Matthew Shardlake. He was taking him to Hatfield. He says, we always pay in gold at Hatfield Palace, Fowbray said proudly. The innkeeper bowed again gratefully. We are always honored to trade with the palace. So further along in this part of the book, Shardlake and his assistant Nicholas, they're up in their room in the inn, and this is what they're talking about. And this book is narrated by Matthew Shardlake, who is the main character. And he says, I picked up the bright new coin, stamped with the head of our 11-year-old king, a serious expression on his face. Around the edge was stamped Edward VI, by the grace of God, in Latin. I weighed the coin in my palm. And now I quote, he's talking to Nicholas. It says, it's bigger than the one they put out at the beginning of the year, but more copper in it. And then Nicholas replies, I think so. God's death does Protector Somerset take us all for fools as he robs the country of its silver. All this chopping and changing just raises prices even further. Beer is up another farthing. I smiled wryly, that's Shardlake, and he said, he needs silver from somewhere to pay for his Scottish war, along with the latest round of new taxes Parliament has granted him. When the old king died, I thought all this pouring money into unwinnable wars would stop. Not that things would even get worse. So So who's the protector? Well, he's Somerset, because the King Edward VI is underage. You know, he's the guy who's running the show, right? So even then, you know, they were inflating the money supply. They did it through debasing the coins, putting more copper in it, and it led to higher prices. And it was to pay for wars, the same thing that's happening today. So the more things change, the more they remain the same, as the French would say, right? So if you're lucky enough to have some monetary savings, I personally have been able to, you know, convert some of my savings into physical gold and silver. And in my opinion, that's one of the only ways to protect yourself, of course, against monetary inflation and debasement of the currency. Of course, if there is a collapse of the system, there's a lot of other things that you have to protect, you know, prepare for. I'm just covering here more the monetary side of things. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Make sure you also share this video far and wide to your friends, families, and colleagues. And you can also follow me on DTube, Steemit, and on Twitter. I wish you all a great weekend. Take care. Bye.